In this lesson, I am going to go over how to create basses using FM synthesis. Now, this is a really popular way to create basses, and once you understand what this type of bass sounds like, then you can easily identify that this is using FM synthesis. When you are using FM, it is usually supposed to be used with a sine wave, but with Serum, you can use any waveform or wave table that you want. But let's just start with using sine waves, and we can hear and listen to the sound of a sub of that sine wave FME sound that you get from using a sine wave. Now let's start with the oscillator A going to the basic shapes and doing a sine wave, and then we will do the same thing with oscillator B, doing this to basic shapes and a sine wave. Now, a lot of times when you are doing FM, you have this drop down, so you could do FM from B, which FM from A here, which means that I could have this one outputting and sending this oscillator A into oscillator B, or I could go to this one and do FM from B, where I have this one outputting sound and then having the oscillator A be input to the oscillator A to create the FM sound. Now, most of the time you will want this level to be all the way down, but you can have it up if you're doing some kind of like complex D&B sound, maybe like a dubstep sound, or just sometimes I find that you could actually have this turned up. That's what they sound like together. And let's go and put this randomness down because I have just one voice of unison for each of these, and start raising up this FM. And now I will lower the level so you can hear just what that FM bass sounds like. And if I have this at -2 octave, then I won't really notice too much of a difference. You mainly start hearing this FM style sound when you have this oscillator that you're getting the FM from up a few octaves. So there you can hear I'm going through them all. And let's say I had my envelope shaped like a pluck. Turn that voicing on to mono. And that is the basic FM sound. So we've got that pluckiness going on. Now I could do something where this is up and then we have the envelope 2 tied to the filter like I was showing you in the earlier lesson. And let's just make this decay a bit bigger. And maybe I don't really like that. Let's take that off. We're not going for like the best melody in the world. I'm just playing a C3 just because I want you to hear what I'm doing in shaping the sound. So maybe I'll do something like that. Another common thing that you can do is taking this envelope and assigning it to the FM from B, and this is how you'll get a donk bass, and you usually don't need too much modulation. But you can see how I'm getting like that round sound, almost like a donk bass. And to get that donk even more intense, like I was showing you, we could use this envelope 3 at a really short decay and assign this to the FM so that it goes up really high, really fast. And that's how we get that like donk knock style bass. And all I'm doing there is just shifting that octave up and down. And I'm just playing around with a filter there so you can get more control of like the decay of the sound is a bit more filtered off. I could do something like, I will show you now because I used up all of my envelopes. I'm going to go now into the LFO section. I could create this as being a LFO with an envelope, speed up this rate really, really fast, and assign this LFO to my global master tuning to get more of a knock sound. And this is a technique you can do for like 808 style of basses. You can hear how I'm getting that like really loud knock sound. And you can play around with this rate and also the output to control the amount. And that's something to think about if you're doing like 808 style basses. But this is like kind of like a basic FM style bass pluck. Now, if I raise this up +7 semitones, you might hear this type of tone in some bass house or bass style music, where you have this oscillator up +7 semitones or even +4, or even +3. You might hear the low end filtered off. So let's lower, let's take a high 12. Maybe it's filtered like that, but then we can add the sub back with a direct out sub. That's distorting. I could add in some hyperdimension. I could add on a compressor. Maybe I'll put it into the distortion. Maybe I'll lower this -3 octave. So, I mean, I'm just throwing out a lot of things, like a lot of things you can do with the FM. Maybe I can put this to the mix. And the more that you play around with these basses and the FM sounds, then the more that you can really understand how to create some more of these sounds. And especially for like D&B bass music, bass house, a lot of the Skrillex sounds, a lot of his sounds are using just these sine waves and then some form of like FM synthesis. So let me take this off. I mean, I could do something where this is an LFO and I have this on, let's say, trigger BPM 1/4. And maybe instead of having this FM tied to the envelope, I could tie it to the LFO. Maybe I'll take this off that cutoff as well. Maybe I'll also tie it to the level, and then maybe I'll tie it to the sub as well. So you could do some cool things like that. So let's check out maybe some presets that we've got and see if we can identify some uses of how I am using this FM stuff. So here is like a donk style bass. Now, as you can see, we've got the envelope 1, the envelope 2 is controlling the FM. This envelope 3 has the noise on the kick attack. I'm using harmonic series, which is kind of like a sine wave, but using multiple cycles, and then the analog B sine wave is like a sine wave, but adds a bit more distortion, or just like a bit of grittiness to it. And then this LFO1 is really fast, tied to that FM to give it that knock sound. So let's bypass that to get that knock. And then here are some of the effects. Let's see what else we've got. Here's an example of a bass. This one's from like Malp, Drugs from Amsterdam. Here's an example. I've got the sine wave for the FM, but I'm using a different oscillator. So I'm not using a sine wave, I'm using a pulse wave. And in this example, I just have this envelope 1 tied to the filter cutoff and the FM. So I'm keeping it simple on this FM because I just want it to be really plucky. And we can take that off. So I'm almost just using it for like a bit of grit. So you just have to really play around with modulating this FM and seeing how it affects your sound. Let's see if I've got any other, I can show any other examples. So there I've just got -2 on this bass with this one at 0. I'm cutting off that low end like I showed you that you can do, and adding the sub back in with that direct out, and then I have the filter back on. To get more of that wah, 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 and see I have this attack slower. To get kind of like a wubby sound. So that's how you can play around with that attack. And that's an example of like where you want to use 2 different envelopes because maybe you don't want the maybe still want some initial attack and just want the high end to kind of wub up. Here's an example of a organy sound. And you can see I've got the FM from B, no modulation on it. I have this one up +7 and this one up +7 because I want the bass down -7 essentially, or down 7 semitones. And this envelope is just tied to this filter, and I'm cutting off the low end again because I'm adding in the sub again with the direct out. So that's the technique that I do relatively frequently, is cutting off that low end so that I can add the sub back in with a direct out for the FM stuff, because that sound that you're getting from that FM modulation, it's adding in like this high frequency information that you want, and you want to like affect that with these effects, but maybe not affect the low end. So that can be harder sometimes. So that it's what I'll do is I'll add in this sub like direct out for like a lot of these FM sounds, or even like you'll start to notice this as you get into making more like bass house basses or bass house leads, or I guess they're like DnB, where you have this like really smooth sub low end. And a lot of times that's just because you have two layers. You have maybe this serum is just this sound, and then you have a whole separate track that is the sub. And that's also another thing that you can do, is just have a separate track just for the sub. If for some reason you want to maybe just add a bit more distortion to that second sub on the second track, and maybe not use this direct out for the sub because maybe you're not getting enough level or something out of it that you wanted. So that's how you can use FM synthesis for a bass pluck. I'll see you in the next episode.